Hey, so as with all the ones, start out with the disclaimer. The views expressed here represent mine and mine alone and do not reflect that of my employer, any organization that I'm affiliated with. And of course, this is Ready, Set, and Engage, episode 6. I sort of have a rough agenda. I included the Werther effect just because I think the Werther effect has a lot of import to show us based on some of the news over the last week. I wanted to talk about a triangle map to a bell curve and sort of some of the ways we think about depression as a society, and maybe we have the model completely wrong. It's been an interesting week, and so one of the things I would like to talk about, of course, is mourning and depression and sort of how that plays out and how it's unique to a person. And then Patty and I had a real fun conversation. Sort of we'll go into the mourning piece and how that plays out, or how that plays into this. But we started talking about tribalism and sort of the different aspects or different interaction models that men have versus women, and some of the reasons that might actually have sort of a survival benefit and or sort of a culturally sound model for engagement and understanding of the world around us. So, yeah, all right, James, I definitely will. Cool. So the Werther effect, there was unfortunately a lot of end of watches that were in the news this week. The Werther effect is this effect that was found in the 1700s. And basically what happened is a person by the name of Goethe published a novel called The Sorrows of Young Werther. And it's this very dramatic book, and it became wildly popular. Well, the problem was that all kinds of people joined. The problem was that the protagonist in the book, Werther, at the end of the book, like, he goes through all these sort of tragedies in his life, and the summation of the book, I'm going to spoil it, but it's been out for 250 years. So if you haven't read it by now, you're probably not going to read it. The protagonist actually kills himself. He commits suicide. And one of the problems was that it became so popular that there was a spree of suicides over that time period. And so there were something like 5 different countries that banned this book from production, right? Or from import into their country. And so it's what's known as the Werther effect. And why I think that's important and why I think it's critical to talk about right now is because, one, you've got this sort of school shooting thing. 2, you've got sort of murder suicides. And then the third class is police ambushes, which politely, if you're considering ambushing a police, go fuck yourself, in a nice way. Not really. But so why that's important is because every time one of these events happens, there's sort of this spree of additional events that come afterwards, right? Like after Parkland, there were a lot of places that actually shut down because the schools had gun threats or attempted, attacks or whatever. And so the Werther effect plays in. And basically this was proven in like the 1950s and 60s by big data sets. And what they would do is they would look at this phenomenon was discovered. So after a front page article about a suicide, the amount of single person deaths would skyrocket by like 10x over that week in the area that newspaper was published in, right? So if it was front page in Seattle, then in the neighboring cities, the death rate of single person deaths or mortality, I guess is the way to put it, would skyrocket. And it wasn't all super crystal clear of, oh, these people all hung themselves or shot themselves or whatever. It would sort of have this trail over, this map over, such that some of them were single car accidents where there was a single person that was a single fatality. Some of it would, of course, be that suicide thing. Some of it would be sort of a suicide by some other means. And so some look like accidents, some look like intention, but it was one person when the news article was about one person dying. The other thing that was found is if it was a murder-suicide, then the multi-person fatality rate for that same area would go up, while the single-person fatality rate would stay level, right? So that means if somebody killed somebody else and took their own life as a means of suicide, then the number of fatalities where multiple people were killed would go up 10x in that region, but the suicide rate would stay the same, meaning that they were using the paradigm that they discovered in the news article in order to make some summation that life is meaningless, whatever, and then take action. So I think we need to be a lot more careful as a country just in how much we aggrandize these events and put them front and center in people's minds. So there was a spree, I feel like this week, of officer ambushes, which is just totally reprehensible and really frustrating. And so so maybe that's something to keep in mind, something to think about when you think about what articles you share on Facebook, whether, and there's a lot of good intent in just sharing frustration or sharing sorrow on those things, but there is sort of that odd impact that they can have on life. And so wanted to mention the Werther effect. I'll stop ranting about it there. So in high school, we're gonna switch to triangles. In high school, when we were in health class and like middle school, they talked about this great valley, right? And they said depression is this great valley. And so you fall off a cliff and you fall down into the bottom of this valley. And now you have a cliff to go up, but you can't see what's on the top side of the cliff, right? And so on the top side of the cliff is supposed to be happiness and rah, everything's great and wonderful. And while that's a very interesting paradigm to think about, I think it's fundamentally flawed. And the reason I say that is because I don't think that there's this duality of outcome. I think that the axiom that's being used is actually a misrepresentation of what it should be or what it could be, what's realistic versus what's philosophically interesting. Okay, and so I'm gonna give you, I heart your face, right? And so if you think of this valley, it's this thing in the bottom, and then when you're looking up at the top side, it would be, hey, at the top side is happiness, and so what you need to strive for is happiness. And this is again where I sort of call bullshit on the entire model, right? Not that this is inherently wrong, Representative Pond, sure, James. But here's this valley, and we think that the outcome you need to chase is actually moving yourself completely out of the valley and thus towards happiness. And what I would say is, while I think that's a fascinating concept, if we take that valley and we split it put it upside down, then we could take and draw that nice little bell curve that we've talked about a couple times right over the top, right? And then the median point, or the highest point on the horizon that you can see, is actually the crest of that bell. If you take the triangle model, right? And sorry, you'll have to pretend this is flat right here. If you take the triangle model, then again, standing here at the bottom, when you're in depression, you can't see happiness. And so stop fucking aiming for happiness. But from the bottom, what you can see is you can see this point of horizon. And it's still fair to say that you don't understand what that looks like oftentimes, right? But what that often looks like is just that middle ground. It's just the average, right? And so it's more successes than losses, or at least the ability to focus on them. So if you were to take and drop stuff down, right? And I wish I had like M&Ms or something to plop down here, but I don't do sugar. So whatever this is, we'll just drop sticks at it. And you say, okay, you've got this sort of natural structure. You drop stuff down. One goes left, one goes right. Okay. Fairly simple in premise, fairly simple to understand. Why is that important? Because when you're depressed or when you're sad, you get really fucking good at seeing all the stuff that comes down this side, right? These are all the small pebbles and big rocks that fall on you when you're at the bottom of the triangle over here, right? And you're very good at counting the number, the size, shape. You're very good at focusing on them. Oh, that rock was fucking huge. That's how late I was on that payment last month, and oh, I hate myself for it, right? Well, the problem is you don't see all the good shit that's falling off this other side because you're focused on the wrong viewpoint, okay? So I would say that the way to get out of that is actually aim for this median ground. And the other fascinating dynamic of this heart, which I picked up at random because I needed half of a triangle shape, is it's got ladders in here. It's got little steps that aren't showing up very well. There you go. And so it's got these little ridges in there, right? So when you think about taking yourself and trying to move out of depression, what I would prefer you think of is sort of like backing up a hill, right? And so each time you get to a reasonable spot to rest, you should set a marker. And now you're looking at the next couple spots to make you feel a little bit better or win small and measurable accomplishments such that you can continue to climb the hill towards this top point. And this top point is not happiness. It's just sort of meeting ground. It's just good enough for now, right? It's I've accomplished more, and now I'm at a spot where I can see a little bit of good, I can see a little bit of bad, but I have that opportunity to choose which one I focus on. You spent so much time building a value system of I'm recognizing bad that you miss the good. And so if you can simply go to that middle ground, all of a sudden now you can actually see stuff. Now you can appreciate what's going on in life. And I think that that's the model that we should look at when we think about trying to move away from depression or trying to overcome something. Look for the smaller steps that are intermediary steps into getting into that middle ground. So we mentioned depression as sort of the model for that. This week was sort of a fascinating week. There was some news in Sela that happened over the weekend. Hey, Craig, you made it when we're live. Woohoo! Fascinating news over the weekend, or unfortunate news over the weekend for people back in my hometown. And was thinking about it a little bit and trying to rationalize through it probably on Tuesday or something. And then on Wednesday morning, I go and I'm in the middle of a meeting, and my wife texts me and she says, hey, not an emergency, but give me a call when you get a chance. And you guys wouldn't know this, but I don't talk on the phone very much. Like, I'm not a big phone talker. And so I was like, oh, okay. And so I called her, and what happened on Tuesday evening is my grandfather, my dad's dad, passed away. And so it's this really interesting dynamic, right? Because from a logical perspective, he hasn't been a big part of our lives for like my whole life, right? But from an illogical or a sort of irrational perspective, it's loss. And most people equate loss to a bad thing, right? And so there's a little bit of emotionality and that uncertainty when you think about just loss. And so, I teared up a little bit. Again, it's okay to tear up. It's okay to engage in that way and to play stuff out as you would. But I don't know if it was rational towards him, or just the concept or the idea of loss in general. And so Wednesday morning, I left work. Patty and I drove over the mountains, and we went to spend the day with family. And so it's just been a fascinating time to sort of reflect on it, and why we experience loss, but also sort of the ceremonial aspects we build up around loss, right? If I were to rewind to sort of a tribalistic society and just pretend we're a tribe for a minute, would we as a tribe go through all the ceremonial pieces? Well, maybe, right? And would it make sense? Maybe. Okay. So if you're rewinding back to days of a little bit more mortality for a group when somebody dies, because now you've got disease, you've got all the animals coming in, you just sort of open yourself up, then it would make sense to get people together as a group, right? To one, mourn, which is sort of the ceremony that you build up around it, but two, help to take care of the body and remove it from that setting, whether that's burial or whether that's sort of a ceremonial, send them out into the water, or put them on some platforms to dry out, and sort of that natural mummification process. Like, it makes sense to get them away from the tribe. And so I think that some of the ceremonies we have are sort of this story that we built up around it, such that we have this inclination to come together as a tribe to sort of give those last rites or that last engagement. And so I thought it was sort of an interesting dynamic to play with. You don't have to believe it. It's just thoughts that came through my head. Thank you, Craig. So while we were driving over, and we were eating some food, basically one of my friends who I haven't talked to in a while, like I don't talk to a lot of my friends very often, not that it's good or bad. In fact, that's what we'll get into, but I don't talk to him very often. And he started sending me texts, and so we were dialoguing back and forth. And Patty says, yeah, James, Viking funeral, burning boats. She says, I don't understand how your guys' mind works, right? Like you're friends, but you don't talk all the time. You don't hang out very often. You just sort of, you're these friends, and I understand you've known them for decades and been friends for decades, but it seems like you guys don't maintain the relationship so much. Instead, it's just sort of there, and then periodically you guys talk and engage, and it's like you guys never left off. And she's like, for me, I got to talk to my friends a lot more regularly than that. I hang out with my friends a lot more regularly than that. And I engage with my friends a lot more regularly than that. And I had a burrito in my hand, and so I'm like, let me play with that idea and then come back to it. And so now every time we're talking and she says something that she thinks that I'm going to overanalyze, she goes, no, don't play with it. But so this one she let me play with, right? And so took a couple minutes, and I reflected, and I came away with a similar sort of tribal mindset, right? So if you rewind back to, you can use a movie as the paradigm. You can use just reality or literature or history or whatever. Let's pretend let's pretend we're going back to 300, right? Why not? So Leonidas has his best friend, and I forget the dude's name, and they're all machismo and whatever. That Sparta was a fascinating sort of piece of history if anyone's bored and wants to read about sort of this warrior society. But you rewind that far ago, right? And you think about the dynamics of the culture. Well, it was war was very common, and warring tribes were very common. And so this idea that you would build up the ability to aggress or to fight in war, yeah, that you would go to fight in war, right? Whether that was the long wars of the Roman Empire as they were expanding out, the Ottoman Empire, and so on. You would spend a lot of time out there warring. Hi, Manny. At war. And so for a survival mechanism, when you're out at war and there is no women to take care of you. Oh. Ziggy, get out. Go downstairs.
I can see you.
You can see me? Uh-huh.
Yeah.
You might be the most cutest thing on this whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you think about them going to war, well, having a friend that would watch your back actually increases your chances of survival, right? If somebody, Ziggy, go downstairs. Go. Maddie, can you close the door so Ziggy goes downstairs, please? Thank you, Rebecca. So at war, it's very important that another person's watching your back, right? And so you sort of build this dyadic, or sometimes like 2 or 3 people. So it could be a dyad or a triad where you have this engagement, and it's mutually beneficial, right? You're watching out for their back, they're watching out for yours. If you rewind back to that era, sometimes there was additional sort of sexuality to it. That's obviously changed over years, but the premise is that by watching out for their back and them watching out for yours, and you guys having sort of that kinship, you're increasing. Yeah, wake you up in the morning. You're increasing your likelihood of survival, right? And thus the likelihood that you'll come back to the tribe after the war has ended. And so I thought that was interesting from a male dynamic, right? And so when you would come back from war, well, then you're no longer at war. You no longer have that same need for that survival, or that relationship that builds survival, or that likelihood of outcome. And so you're able to relax, and you go back to family life, and then you're gardening or farming or working to make money. She's going to tell more stories than I am. And so at time of peace, when the men came back, well, all of a sudden they didn't have that same goal. They didn't have that same sort of aggression to deal with, or that fight to deal with at the time. And so it was okay for them to relax and not maintain that relationship as much. But when the war came around again in 3 to 5 years, or sometimes less, depending on the society, well, now they needed that strong relationship to enter back in. And so from a tribalistic viewpoint, it makes a lot of sense. And that preservation of outcome, or that likelihood of, hey, we're going to survive and come back together. And then the other aspect, right, is that for women, the dynamic plays out differently, okay? And does that make sense from a tribal perspective? Well, Maybe. And so if you think about that same tribal aspect, the men take and go away to war, right? Then a lot of your strongest warriors have left. So the women that are there, still in the tribe, need to grow the kids, like make sure the kids are safe. They need to farm and do enough to generate food. They need to cook and maintain that stuff. And so now it becomes more important to rely on the strength of the group instead of this individual outcome of watch my back, right? And so I think gossip winds up being something that's derived from that premise, right? It's this social engagement where they're able to share what's going on. And then if somebody is an outlier or if somebody's working against the tribe, then they can shun them as a group, push them aside, and then maintain that structure of the group, right? And so the female bullying aspect winds up being a lot more social than it does like aggressive like men. And so it's a different dynamic. But when you think of it from that aspect, it makes a lot of sense because now you're increasing the likelihood of survival for not only you and your kids, but your safety while the men are at war. And who knows, maybe today's society is a little bit extrapolated or pulled away from that because we're not at war, or as many of our young, healthy men are not out at war at this point because, you know, you've got term limits, you don't have a draft, you know, the sort of Western society has calmed down a little bit in war because we've upped the technology. But the same sort of premise or structure seems to make sense. And so if you were to take that as a model and say, well, how do you preserve that model over time? Then you would build stories around it, or you would build play, right? And so now you're starting to understand where men will, Riley is so silly, where you'll have play, where men will be sort of not necessarily socially isolated, but they'll be, you know, they'll build something and maybe one or two people can build on that same thing, right? Or whether it's the little pegboards where you hammer in stuff or screw in little bolts or all that stuff. It's sort of a smaller surface area. But girls often get toys for like tea parties or dolls, right? And so it's this play that we've developed over the years to help preserve that sort of outcome of girls focus on this social fabric that maintains their relationships with other people in the tribe and thus their likelihood for survival. And then men, of course, gravitate towards, well, if I have a couple of really close friends that I can count on in time of war, or when I'm in the field doing construction or whatever. A lot of construction is like 2-3 man teams, depending on how big the project. Well, now you're starting to see those same sort of dynamics play out. And so we're driving and I'm saying all this stuff, and she's like, okay, maybe. And so I think that sort of plays out pretty well in even modern society, but I think it's sort of based on that Western philosophy, right? He's so funny.
Yeah.
Sent me tea. Thanks, Craig. Men going to war, friendships, less kinship, having long times, fitting the tribe, socializing yet. I thought there was one other aspect of that I was going to talk about, and I'm not. Are you waving? I'm not able to remember it right now. Coming back from war. So the same thing applies, right? Like you go to war, your enemy or your outcome is very targeted, right? You're supposed to kill bad guys, and they're bad, you're good, right? It's sort of the basic narrative that we give to our troops when they go to war. When you come back, it winds up that Craig, you'll have to clarify which part and how does it relate to video games, because there's probably a lot of connectivity there actually. When you go to war, the enemy is very obvious, right? And so you're able to align with each other and rely on your sort of tribal bonds with other people in your units to say, oh, well, we need to go do this, and we have this common goal, right? And now we all march towards that thing. And then a very interesting thing happens when you get out of the military, right? Because you had a very clear goal, a very clear enemy when you were in there. You were either training for war or you were at war. Those are sort of your two dualities of outcome in the military. And so it was very clear what you're supposed to be doing, very clear, what was next. And then when you remove people from the military, right, end of active service or discharge or retirement or whatever, well, now it becomes a little less clear on what that goal is, right? There's no we're good and they're bad. Instead of it's, hey, I'm out here and I need to now find goals. And I think that when I put it in that framework, it explains why when I got out of the military, you can see me. I was possibly a little bit lost for a couple of years, and so I went to college and did the college thing because it seemed like the right thing to do. Right, that was the path that everyone was saying, oh, leads to better outcome or better jobs, and so on. But I don't know that I really understood that as a goal. It was sort of something to do while I figured out what to do next. And so the path from leaving the military, where you have very prescribed goals and you have that really strong bond with the tribe, and coming out to the civilian world, and then you're like, well, absolutely, Rebecca, that is a beautiful call out. Veterans and Hard Chargers, Team Rubicon, is a fantastic nonprofit organization. Rebecca and I are part of the Seattle City leadership team. Again, my views don't represent theirs. This is my views and mine alone. But if you're looking to get involved, that is a terrific organization to work with. They get shit done, and it's incredible. Maybe we'll talk about Houston on another one of the episodes. But so when you get out, you sort of lose that view of, hey, what's the goal or what's the next thing I'm going to try and achieve? And we keep looking for this happiness or fulfillment or the end goal career that I'm going to retire from and live happily ever after. And well, unfortunately, fairy tales don't tend to happen a lot. And so what happens is a lot of people get out of the military and they're like, what now, right? And it leads to a little bit of social isolation. And then you're like, oh, people won't understand and other people won't understand. Well, once you start building that set of goals and you understand the targets you're going for, which isn't happiness or success or this transcendence idea, instead it's just, I want to get a job. And after I get the next job, then I can think about how to stack forward and make it into more of a career or how to elevate myself within that role. And right, you set these smaller goals, and now it becomes, okay, well, what are the 3 steps I need to take this week to help make it to that goal? And now that's very achievable. And now you can sort of regain your composure and your trajectory where you're striving for something that is now finite and something that's achievable, right? And I feel that we really don't do a good job as a society in helping to paint that as an understanding of what the target needs to be or how to set appropriate goals such that you get a bit of challenge, but it's overcomable challenge. And after each one that you surpass, then you're able to feel sort of more emboldened and more content with how things are going in life, right? Yeah, I won't say relationship. Somebody very close to me was having some struggles over the last year, and so helping them to see goals and start painting shorter goals, actually, I think did a really good job of them getting back into the fight and back into engagement. And so I'm super proud of them, and I don't know if I've told them that before, so that's work on me. So yeah, the Werther effect, and please stop sharing that stuff about death, suicide, homicide, all that stuff. I think it sets the wrong precedent, or it just engages people to believe in that sort of nihilistic view of life is meaningless, and that thus if it's meaningless, they're doing a duty by helping to fix that meaningless existence, which is just asinine. There's so much meaning to be found in life, but we need to, again, look at it as being worthwhile and important and engage in those goals that help it to be important and show that worth and help build something better. When we sort of think that, well, everything's meaningless because I can't get all the way to transcendence and I'm not all the way to hell, or I'm really close to hell or whatever, then it becomes a very muddled, right? It's a miserable place to be. And so I would love us to just sort of move away from that nihilistic view of meaningless and instead move into life is very meaningful. Now, how can I start making that meaningful? Talked a little bit about the triangle and how it seems like what we need to do is paint the horizon as an accurate and achievable outcome, but it's not happiness, it's not transcendence, and it'll never be. People that are so far off that other side are probably as confused as the people that are so far off in depression. So triangle, mourning, and how that maps to the bell curve. Talked a little bit about mourning, depression, and then of course the tribalistic instincts of men going to war and women being more focused on survival or outcome for the tribe at times of war, when the strong characters or the strong men are off battling and fighting and telling great stories of conquest or whatever. That's not to say that either one of those, it can't exist in the other. In fact, it would make sense in a lot of those for the older warriors or some of the men who are growing older and either aren't war age or have maybe done enough battles and have enough scars that they stay back, and instead they protect the women, they protect the tribe, and that sort of outcome that totally exists. And so if you paint that as a thing, it's not this one and the other. It's not you're either a warrior or you're somebody back doing traditionally female roles or whatever in the tribe. Instead, like, there's a mix of the two, right? If you're out at war, then people who are doing medicine and actually saving the men who are injured, it probably has a mix of women in there as well. And so there is roles for everyone everywhere. It's just sort of how they gravitate out, such that you're sort of improving the likelihood of survival for both ends of that spectrum, or sort of both of those scenarios in the spectrum. Nerf Armory, just a hint, WD-40. Oh, was the door loud? It's not my door, so I don't hear it. Cool. So those are the topics that I had today. I didn't, every conversation impacts me in a positive way. Thank you, Craig. Seeds like a glass of ice, video games. Yep. Cool. Yeah. The comments, like commentaries we were going through. So I think that's those are the topics I wanted to cover for today. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll talk again soon. Have a good one.